Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining the Market Performance and Planning Forum, quarterly forum that engages stakeholders in review of market performance issues and a high-level dialogue on release planning, implementation, and new market enhancements. I'm Brenda Corona, representing the ISO Stakeholder Affairs Group, and I'll be providing support for this meeting. In today's meeting, we do have a few friendly reminders about this meeting. We do plan to work together and ask questions during the call. Feel free to raise your hand and your line will be unmuted. Please start by saying your name and affiliation. Today's objective is to continue the dialogue implementation planning for the market performance issues, key in on market performance topics that are shared for the 2022 release plans, and all this information provided on specific initiatives and support of market participants in budget and resource planning. Next, focus on implementation planning, clarifying timelines, and external impacts. The following of policy discussion should occur in the initiative stakeholder process, which we will dive in this meeting. To continue on with my reminders is by this meeting, we will have recorded and posted available under the user groups, a recording meetings, as well the market performance and planning forum for 2022. For today's agenda, we will go over the four main updates: market performance update with Guillermo, and then a policy update with Brad Cooper, and then lastly, release update with Trang. These four major topics will take roughly around an hour or so of a time, so please be mindful of your questions during each of the slides. And if you do like to wait till this presenter has a pausing moment to ask a question, please raise your hand and we will call on you. We will also be monitoring the chat to ask any questions and provide that back to our subject matter experts if needed. But other than that, we will go ahead and start this meeting. But if there's anything we can do to help support your stakeholder call for this forum, we'll be here to talk to you during chat and raising your hand. And after you're asking your question, please put your hand down so we can make sure we are able to ask questions for everyone. For the market performance update, we have an update from the market analysis and forecasting team with the flexible ramping product analysis. And I will go ahead and invite Guillermo to unmute his line, and please go ahead and begin.
Thank you, Brenda. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity to have this update. This is the first one for 2022. And as we usually organize the presentation for these forums, we have a few items that we would like to discuss in detail. And then we also have the second part, that is the standard set of metrics about overall the market performance. We typically focus on the first section, that is the market issues or the hot topics, and we leave the second section just for your information. If there are any specific questions and we have time at the end, we can try to address those. The materials we are covering this morning are quite in a different range of topics, and they are obviously coming from the different efforts that we are going through from the CAISO markets. We're going to cover the first one, that is the update on the flexible ramping product, the FRP performance. We are going to have also a discussion on the congestion revenue rights, the wholesale cost for the CAISO, and some update on the storage resources performance that we have seen in the recent months. Each topic may be quite extensive in discussion. We are trying to summarize here the main items. And I would like to pause through the presentation in case you have any questions. And if you have any questions at any time, please just raise your hand. And the very first topic is the performance of the FRP. Some of you may have participated in the last Market Surveillance Committee session that we held back in February. And I understand there were still a few questions regarding the FRP performance, obviously because not everybody was able to participate in that discussion. The material that you have here is quite similar to what we presented in the Market Surveillance Committee, and we also posted early this week a report in which we can have a more detailed explanation of the different metrics and the dynamics that we are highlighting in the assessment. The idea to present this topic here is to ensure that there is an opportunity in a different forum for those that couldn't participate in the last MSC. And let me start by the very basics, right, and put the reference as why we have the FRP. We have implemented this product since 2016, and the idea of the FRP is to ensure that we have RAM capability to address when uncertainty realizes. The type of uncertainty that we are addressing with the FRP is that associated with the net load. Uncertainty due to load, solar, and wind production. And we have this product that is in the real-time market, and we are effectively ensuring that by the time we solve the market and we meet the needs for load through the energy supply, we also optimize and ensure that we have the RAM capability. And we have this product in the 15 and the 5-minute market. And one of the main concerns that has been popping up in the recent discussions, recent relatively speaking, because this has been a concern for a few years, I would say, has to do with the performance overall of the product. And when I refer to performance, there are many dimensions you can associate with that. But one of the obvious areas of concern is about the price formation. And the price formation has been effectively the most visible item in the discussions we have had over the last 4 years, and has been the focus of attention in the different enhancements that we have had. Next slide, please. And this graphic just captures the evolution that we have over the years since the time we implemented the FRP back in November 2016. And you can see that we have several efforts through this period for the last 5 years or so. As we assess, as we analyze the performance of the FRP, we realize inefficiencies, gaps that we have tried to address. And early in the implementation of the FRP, we have a couple of rounds regarding the price formation of the FRP, and we implemented a couple of enhancements. And we adjust incrementally the formulation that we implemented back in 2016 to address specifically those concerns. And those concerns were of different nature, and they reflected eventually in the price formation. In some cases, we had the price driven by the individual areas rather than the system-wide area. We have unbounded the constraints in the system, and that created some dynamic with the prices. In some cases, the FRP for some individual areas was negative because that was offsetting the system-wide price. And over the time, we were addressing those as we found them. Then back in 2019, around September, as part of an overall assessment that we did to the pricing of the CAISO market, we dedicated a good section and effort to the analysis of the FRP overall. And that was the starting points for a policy initiative that was initiated in November 2019. Among the different areas that we found as a concern from this pricing performance was the issue that we were losing the capacity procured in a given FMM interval, and that was lost in the subsequent interval. We have some concerns about what resources were getting the procurement for FRP because they couldn't deploy and they couldn't perform. We have a concern based on the composition of the procurement of the FRP across the system-wide and Western energy imbalance market, and that led into the requirement for a minimum constraint for significant areas, specifically for the CAISO. And the main one was related to what we call deliverability. The main concern we found at that time was that even though the market was procuring the FRP and it was able to meet the requirement, when it came to the next interval and be able to realize, to deploy that capacity because uncertainty realized, that capacity was not readily available because typically the procurements were assigned to resources that were decrementally dispatched because of congestion or because they were stranded behind some specific EIM transfer constraints. So when it was needed, it was not really deliverable. And that was the main and largest effort that we have in that policy initiative. And as a result of that, we are expecting to shift the formulation, the procurement of the FRP into what we call nodal procurement. Rather than being system-wide, we are moving into a more locational-wide procurement. That piece is still scaled to be implemented by fall 2022. There were a few items that were already implemented in an earlier stage. Some of those happened as early as November 2020, like the implementation of the minimum requirement. Along the discussion, there was also some concern about the accuracy of the approach we use to calculate the flexible ramping requirement for the CAISO and for all the EIM areas. And as a result of that, we are also proposing to use a more sophisticated approach to calculate the uncertainty requirements. The current requirement relies on a specific historical data set, and you are assuming that history is going to repeat. The methodology that we're going to implement as part of this fall 2022 is going to consider not only the historical information, but also the conditions that are happening at that point on time, such as internalizing the weather conditions through the forecast for load, wind, and solar. And this has been, in a nutshell, the evolution of the FRP effort. And you can see there have been many steps along the way to try to address different concerns. In the most recent discussions we have specifically with the Market Surveillance Committee, there is still this pressing concern of the price signals that FRP is sending. And that is really what originated much of the recent discussion. And one of the most stringent cases that we have for this concern is that during the summer conditions, when we were with tight supply conditions, the FRP price was not really there. It was muted. It was generally zero in the CAISO across the EIM areas, across the full footprint. And that raises the natural question as to why, even under these tight conditions, the price is still mute at $0. And this is the core of the discussion for today. Next slide, please. If I could summarize the main concerns that are applicable to the FRP performance, I would classify those in three main topics. And the first one is obviously the price formation. Generally speaking, we have seen that historically prices for FRP have been zero or very low. The second main concern is the deliverability and utilization of FRP. Once we procure it at regardless what price it was, how effective, how usable is that capacity when it's needed because uncertainty realizes. And the third one is the requirements, how to more accurately calculate the uncertainty, taking into account the historical information and the conditions that we are going to have. These three concerns may eventually result in a byproduct consequence, because if the FRP is not working efficiently, that means we need to go back to the basics of why we need to have the FRP. It needs to be there to ensure that we have the capacity that is needed to absorb the uncertainty when that realizes. If the uncertainty continues to realize and we don't have this efficient product to handle, naturally we're going to be in a place where there will be other actions to be taken to be able to address that uncertainty. And one of those is what we have been discussing in other forums, that is about the operator's actions, effectively the load conformance, the adjustments that are done to the load forecast in order to create a room to position resources that effectively and de facto is taking the action that the FRP effectively should be doing if working properly. Next slide, please. Let me elaborate quickly on each of these three main concerns. The first one is the price formation, and the concern is reflected as the frequency is too low for non-zero prices. This is a matrix that shows over the last 2 years or so for the different energy, for the different Western energy imbalance areas, how frequently the prices of the FRP have been non-zero. And obviously, a larger number is good, a lower number is not that good. And if we focus, for instance, on the CAISO column, that is the third one from left to right, we can see that historically, in early 2020, the frequency in which prices were non-zero was basically zero. It was a fraction of a percent. These are percentages. And there is a very neat change of pattern starting in November 2020. We can see that we go from a fraction of a percent to over 10% in November 2020, and it has been hovering there anywhere up to 16%. And that has a reason we will later explain. But you can see that in general, the matrix is quite red, indicating that most of the time, for most of the areas, the FRP prices are non-zero in a very low range. And that is how we can capture the main concern about the price formation. Next slide, please. This is specifically the CAISO, and you can see here more graphically how the pattern changed starting in November 2020, because that is when we implemented the minimum constraint for the requirement of CAISO. And it's applicable only for CAISO because through the assessment that we did as part of the policy initiative, we were looking for those areas that have a significant share of the overall uncertainty in the system. And given the size of the CAISO is the only one that fits into that big share of over 60% of the overall requirement. Once we implemented that constraint for the 15-minute market, we start to see that now the price starts to show more frequently, and it's expected because obviously we have a minimum requirement that has to be met. Before this constraint, it was just the natural dynamics of the interplay in the Western EIM, where potentially the CAISO procurement could be coming from different areas across the footprint, and therefore there could still be a zero value associated with that procurement. Next slide, please. When we implemented this requirement, this constraint of the minimum requirement back in November 2020, it was applicable to the 15-minute market. I would say that the original expectation through the policy initiative, even though it was not explicit, was to apply this to the 15-minute market. There was some discussion and follow-ups after that as to why that constraint was not enforced in the 5-minute market, that there could be some unintended consequences that now by not enforcing that constraint in RTD, we may be unwinding what we gained from the 15-minute market. We implemented that constraint in the 5-minute market very recently. It was on February 16, and you can see the before and after. We have a very short window of data to show what is the effect after we implemented that constraint in the 5-minute market. But in general, you are going to see that there is not such a dramatic pattern change. And it may be part due to the time of the year where we are. It may be just because the dynamics are still there for the 5-minute market, that even though we have that constraint, naturally we can still procure that capacity. That was indeed one of the reasons why originally we didn't expect to have that constraint in the 5-minute market. Now, since February 16, this is consistent, it's enforced in both the 15 and the 5-minute market. And you see how frequently it has been resulting in non-zero prices of the RTD market. You can see that this is still quite negligible. It's most of the time zero, and in very few days we have a small frequency that may be hovering the 1%. It's still quite a relatively low frequency of non-zero prices. Next slide, please. Now, that still raises the question, even though you have that minimum constraint, even though you have implemented this enhancement, why the prices continue to be systematically in a very low frequency of non-zero, or most of the time zero? And we have to go back to the basics of the current framework that we currently have. And there are, I would say, 4 different design features that are going to have quite an influence on why the prices are zero most of the time. The first one is that, unlike other explicit products that we have in the CAISO market, the FRP is based on opportunity cost. And there is an opportunity cost that may arise when there is a trade-off between energy and FRP. And that is only going to happen when there is a limited condition such that there has to be this trade-off. If there is enough capacity to meet the energy and the FRP needs, the opportunity cost is going to be naturally zero. So it is expected that there will be an opportunity cost in some intervals, but not in every single interval. So it is expected that as a result of that, there will be quite a few times where the FRP price is going to be zero simply because there is no opportunity cost. The second and the third items are quite interrelated, and it has to go to the core of the construct that we have for the FRP in the context of the wider Western energy imbalance market. And there are 2 concepts that are very key to this one. The first one is that the flexible ramping capacity is kind of fungible. You can procure 1 megawatt from a very far remote area that can be utilized or accounted for meeting the need in another far away area. And that's possible. There are non-locational distinction between those megawatts. And the second one has to do with the accounting of the transfer capability that exists for the different areas participating in the Western energy imbalance market. And we have this construct in which, as part of the WIM, we have 1 specific requirement for each individual area, but also we have 1 requirement and 1 model for the system-wide WIM area. Any requirement, any procurement that is coming from a specific individual area to meet that individual area is carried over to account for the system-wide requirement. If there is a shortfall accounted for 1 specific individual area, that also carry over to the procurement of the system-wide WIM area. Next slide, please. And let me try to illustrate this with a very simple illustration. The concept here is that in addition to having the raw uncertainty requirement for each individual area and for the EIM area, we have this concept of transfer capability. And there will be transfer capability as long as there are transfers enabled between areas, let's say between area 1 and 2. When we are going to inform the optimization of what requirement effectively has to be met, we are modeling the fact that the FRP can be procured from internal resources, but also from other resources from other balancing areas that can come through the transfer capability connecting these areas. That is a transfer capability based on the nominal capacity connecting these areas. It is not completely based only on the optimal transfers happening at the time of the market. And what the effective requirement is going to be for each area is the offsetting of that transfer capability. So effectively, the requirement that is going to be enforced to procure the FRP on each area is going to be the original uncertainty requirement minus the net import capability for that area. And that net import capability is the nominal capability given all the interconnections that it has with the balancing areas in the neighboring of that specific area. It may happen very well that given the massive amounts of transfer capability that certain areas have, like CAISO, the net import capability, the element, the term that is offsetting the requirement, can be usually greater than the requirement itself. So just to put an example, we may have an uncertainty requirement, let's say for CAISO, 1500 megawatts. And if the transfer capability for CAISO is 20,000 megawatts, effectively the requirement is going to be zero. We're meaning that we don't have to procure anything explicitly from internal resources because there is enough transfer capability with other areas that the procurement can come from different areas as long as the capability exists for the transfer of the area. And that is indeed what quite frequently happens in the system, not just for the CAISO, but for many other areas. Next slide, please. And just to put a couple of numbers, if we substitute these terms by specific numbers, and these are just toy illustrations, it doesn't represent realistic areas. But let's say that balancing area 1 has an uncertainty requirement of 1500 megawatts, and area 2 has 350 megawatts. Once we account the transfer capability between the two, let's say for area 1, the transfer capability is 4000 megawatts. The effective requirement that is going to be imposed on area 1 to meet FRP capacity is going to be effectively negative or zero in this case, because effectively means we don't have to procure anything explicitly from internal resources. All the procurement can come effectively from the transfers connecting other balancing areas. The ultimate implication of this is that quite typically what we're going to have is a scenario in which the individual area requirement is not going to be driving any procurement, but only the system-wide, the EIM overall area is going to be the one driving the procurement. If the two internal areas making up this illustration for the whole area are going to be negative or zero, it means that the optimization is not going to drive any requirement to meet any internal requirement for area 1 or 2. The only procurement that has to be active in this case is going to be the procurement of at least 2000 megawatts to meet the system-wide area. And these 2000 megawatts can come in any combination between area 1 and area 2, because again, there is no constraint, there is no requirement for each individual area. All what matters is to meet the overall system. And that is typically what we have seen in the real life operation of the CAISO market. Next slide, please. Let me pause here before we move into a different area of the FRP. Brenda, do we have any questions so far?
No questions at this time.
As a reminder, if you are connected to the computer audio or use the Call Me feature in WebEx, you may enter the question queue by using the WebEx raise hand icon located just above the chat panel. You'll hear a beep tone when your line is unmuted. At that time, please state your name and question. If you're just on the phone line and not using the WebEx audio, please dial #2 on your phone to enter the question queue. You'll hear a notification when your line is unmuted. At that time, please state your name and question. I do see one caller in the queue. Please go ahead, your line is unmuted.
Yes, thank you, Steve Greenleaf, Brookfield. Thanks, Guillermo. Great presentation. One quick question on your last slide, just on the kind of dispersion of resources across the entire REAM area. I know today, right, the CAISO operators can and do at times, right, disperse ancillary service procurement within the CAISO, just based on concerns about, not having the resources procured all from one area. Is there any consideration of that for FlexRAMP? And I suppose it's a direct carryover, right, on the FRP into the EDAM construct. You're not anticipating any changes moving to EDAM. I wouldn't think so, but anyway, we could talk a little bit about the dispersion and procurement locations. That'd be great.
Thank you, Steve, for the question. Let me try to answer that in at least two parts. The first one, relating this to the logic that we currently have for AES procurement. Our AES procurement is not locational, it's not nodal, it's regional. Unlike the FRP, that is just one requirement for the entire balancing area. For the AES, that is only a product for the CAISO market right now, for the CAISO balancing area. We have about 7 different regions in the system for AES procurement. We have North, South, Central, Extended, Internal, and that is just to go one step further into a little bit more of granularity. Yeah, there may be some cases in which there may be some congestion conditions that prevent us to be able to utilize certain AES from specific resources. There are some tools that our operators use once they know that that condition is going to happen to basically prevent procurement of AES for specific resources impacted by this congestion event. Now, the interesting part here is that for the FRP, so far, the current construct is not locational, it's just one single area. Part of the way we are addressing this is with the fall 2022 enhancement, and that is completely shifting the paradigm of the procurement for FRP, because now it's going to be nodal procurement, is going to be locational specific, and that should address overall the main concern that we have, that capacity is dispersed and cannot be delivered, maybe stranded behind congestion. This is the new process we are going to have that is going to be more locational based, and it should be addressing all these issues and concerns of deliverability. How this may play later for the EDAM, I think that would be a question that I will just leave for discussion later in another type of forum. But I can tell you that moving forward, this formulation is going to completely change starting with the fall 2022.
Okay, thank you very much. That's helpful.
Okay, and this is a good venue for the second issue, that is about specifically how to deliver the FRP. And this was also part of the assessment that we did back in 2019, and that resulted in this change of the framework for the formulation of the procurement. We are going to be doing this on a more locational basis, because the main concern is that even though megawatt-wise we may be able to meet the requirement, quite frequently we have seen that the procurement is related to areas that are congested. That could be because of internal congestion, specific thermal limitations that we may have internal to each balancing area, or it could be stranded capacity behind EIM transfers. There are some cases that we identified earlier in the year where I would say late last year, in which there were also some specific resource constraints that prevented that deployment of the FRP. And some of those may be related to the storage limitations that we have for certain resources. The whole point here is that it's not enough just to procure the FRP. We need to ensure that that capacity is indeed deliverable, and that has been the main problem that we have in the efficiency of the FRP under the current construct. And we expect that with the formulation change we're implementing, that should be largely addressed. Next slide, please. Now, just to put some numbers to all these implications that we have been discussing. This is a specific case, a real-life case for one interval that we had on the July 9, 2021. This is the day where we have very tight supply conditions, and it's a good benchmark to see how even under these extreme supply conditions, the FRP was getting a price signal that was, generally speaking, zero across the wind area. And there are many different components here. Let me try to unpack this. the very first column, the uncertainty requirement, is the nominal uncertainty requirement coming from this calculation that we do using historical approaches. The effective requirement is the one that is going to be the one enforced in the optimization once we account for the offsetting of the net import capability. That is the formulation that we discussed a few minutes earlier. As you can see, once we account for the net import capability, most of the areas end up having an effective requirement of 0 megawatts. The exception here in this specific case is CAISO, because we have a minimum requirement that has to be at least 925. That is not just because the net import capability was too small to make it 0. It was because even though that dynamic happened, we still have this minimum requirement to be enforced. And it happens that bank also has still a requirement of non-zero. And obviously at the very bottom, you can see that we have the requirement for the system area of about 2,000 megawatts. What this means is that for all these areas that have a requirement of 0 megawatts, we know the price is going to be 0 because you can easily meet a 0 requirement. You are in this constraint singularity condition that your requirement is 0, so you can meet it with any condition because you don't have to procure anything. So we expect that if you go to the far right when we have the rectangle in red, all these prices are going to be 0 simply because there is no requirement to meet, and therefore there is no opportunity cost to arise for these specific resources, and we don't have to trigger the infeasibility with a demand curve for FRP. So it is expected that the consequence is going to be a price of 0. The procurement column, the procurement column, the one that has this circle in green, is going to show that even though many areas have a 0 requirement, still they have to procure some capacity because at the end we still have to meet the procurement needed for the system-wide area of 2,000 megawatts. There are some areas that effectively cannot procure anything because they are effectively exhausted. There is no capability available on those areas, and there are like 6 areas in this snapshot where the requirement was 0 and they didn't procure anything. So still, it's a constraint that can be held strictly, and the price is going to be 0. The ones that are going to procure FRP is for the purpose of meeting these 2,000 megawatts of the EIM area, including the CAISO. Now, if we focus on the CAISO, for instance, the procurement is about 581 megawatts. The minimum requirement was 925 megawatts. We are short. And that is the next column, that is the relaxation. We are short by 344 megawatts. And because we are short, we have this formulation in which we utilize the demand curves to price how far we are short. And it happens that for that magnitude of shortfall of 344 megawatts, the demand curve has a price of $78. That is really what sets the price for the CAISO. Now, if you sum up all the procurement from the different areas, you are going to get about 1,694 megawatts. That is still short of the 2,038 megawatts for the system area. The difference, the gap, is going to be filled in with the amount of relaxation that was associated with the CAISO of 344. Because as I indicated, part of the formulation is that once you identify a shortfall for one individual area, that carries over to meeting the requirement for the system-wide area. And I understand this raised some concerns specifically in the discussion with the Market Surveillance Committee. This is not a change that we implemented recently. This is the formulation we have had since day one of the FRP. And obviously there are some concerns because there are some good points here that why we would reduce effectively the requirement by the amount of relaxation. And there is some history that we try to portray in the paper as to why this approach was taken. Effectively, we are signaling that one area is already short. We are trying to preserve that signal. And I understand there may be different views about this. And as you can see, now we are able to meet the requirement for the system area including the portion of the relaxation coming from the CAISO. And because we are able to fully meet the requirement for the system area, therefore the price is going to be zero. We didn't have to relax the system-wide area requirement, and therefore the price is going to be zero. Effectively, when you see the price outcome of this, is that every area except the CAISO has a FRP price of zero. Effectively, because they don't have any requirement to meet, or even for the system-wide area, we are able to meet the full requirement. And CAISO is the only one that had a price of $78. And when you compare that against the energy prices, that is the last column, that is when you start to have that concern. How can it be that this disconnect exists? Now I hope that you are able to see why this is happening given the construct that we currently have for the FRP. I would say much of this construct, this framework is going to go away with the implementation of the fall 2022, because once we have this nodal procurement, there will be no such concept of the individual area versus the system-wide. Is going to be more on a subset of balancing areas passing the test versus those individuals failing the test. There will be no concept of the net import capability that can offset fully the uncertainty requirements, and because it's going to be nodal, it is going to provide us the ability to actually deploy that capacity. That should address many of the pricing concerns, but also the procurement and deployment of the FRP concerns. Next slide, please. To give you a perspective of how systemic is the concern about the deliverability and utilization of the FRP. Once we procure it, how readily available is that to offset any uncertainty that realizes in the system? Well, we look at for the peak hours of July 9, we can see that, roughly speaking, more than 50% of the capacity was not deliverable because either there was congestion preventing that to happen, not only from the CAISO, but also from the different balancing areas. There could be also EIM transfer constraints preventing that deployment. There could be also economics, and that is not an issue of deliverability, it's more of utilization, because in order for that capacity to be deployed as energy, it has to be in merit. If we have that there was FRP procured to a resource that has a bid price of, let's say, $700, well, the energy price in the energy market has to be at least $700 to be able to be in merit. So we may procure capacity to that resource rightfully because that capacity is available, but the energy price doesn't go that high to require the deployment of that capacity into energy. And there may be some cases, this is back in 2021, where we have some resource constraints preventing that deployment of the FRP capacity. Next slide, please. The third concern is about the requirements per se. When we calculate the uncertainty requirement, as I indicated a few times now, we utilize a historical set. That is the reference that we have of historically how the uncertainty has been realized, and we try to make some statistical assessment of, based on that history, how much we need to procure for moving forward. And obviously, there is no guarantee that history is going to repeat, and there are some limitations as to how accurate in some conditions that approach can be. That is the whole driver as to why we shifted into assessing the uncertainty requirements using a more sophisticated approach. That sophisticated approach is coming as part of the fall release 2022. And in addition to taking into account the historical information of the uncertainty, it is also going to rely on the projected conditions of the load, wind, and solar. Effectively, we're going to use as variables to the calculation of the requirements the forecast for load, wind, and solar. So it's going to be, rather than a constant value, it's going to be a value derived based on the level of the forecast conditions that we have for that point on time. And that would make the calculation more accurate. It doesn't mean it's going to give you higher or lower requirements per se. It's simply that it's going to be coming closer, tracking closer to the actual conditions. Next slide, please. And this is captured through this illustration. All the dots that you have here is the realized historical uncertainty that we have. The flat red line is the current approach in which, regardless of the production point, we are always going to impose the same value for the same interval for the same condition. The green shape that you can see is quite convex and follows naturally the historical performance. Is going to be the requirement utilized in this new approach. And because it's taking into account the actual operating condition based on the forecast, it's going to be able to more properly capture the need for the requirement. When you have lower levels of production, the expectation is that the requirement is going to be much lower. When you are in this mid-range of having high uncertainty, the expectation is that the requirement is going to be comparable and equally high. And by the way, we are discussing this methodology in more detail in one workshop that we have tomorrow in case you are interested in hearing about this more. I think we have a question, Brenda, operator. Can we take that now, please?
Sure. As a reminder, you'll hear a beep tone when your line is unmuted. At that time, please proceed with your question. Please go ahead, your line is unmuted.
Hi, Guillermo. This is Carrie Bentley with the Western Power Trading Forum. I was wondering if you can go back to slide 18, the one that shows when FRP is not deliverable.
Yes. Can we go back, operator, to slide 18, please?
Thanks. As she does that, I'll go through my question. So I was a little unclear what the different bars represented as it related to LES econ, the CAISO LES econ. I think that means LESR. So you're saying that there's some sort of storage constraint preventing FRP deliverability. And I'm wondering if you could just explain a little bit more what's going on there in the market.
Yes. There are different groupings that we have for that plot. One is whether it is CAISO or other specific EIM area. And the other grouping could be either because it is congestion, economics, or resource constraint. And the other grouping could be by the type of resource, whether it's going to be VR, LSE, or PDR, or any other resource. These are the groupings that we utilize there. Now, in general, congestion, we know that is a deliverability issue because the procurement was assigned to a resource that could be in CAISO, EIM, or any type of resource and cannot be deployed because of congestion. Economics is that the procurement was assigned to a resource that once we go into the energy market is not in merit just because the energy price was not high enough to make the resource to be in merit. The capacity is there, it could be deployed, it just needs to hit the right price to be in economic merit. And the last one, that is the constraint, regardless of the resource, is indicating that there is a specific constraint to that resource that is preventing the deployment of that FRP into energy. And I remember we have a couple of cases on the July 9th in which we have some storage resources that they were assigned FRP capacity, but when it comes to the realization of that as energy, there was not enough state of charge to support all that deployment of the capacity. There were some enhancements we did through the second part of 2021 to address that specific issue. So moving forward, that shouldn't be an issue because in order for an FRP to be awarded to that type of resources, the constraint is that they need to ensure that there is enough state of charge to support, to hold that award. Does that help?
It does help a lot. Thanks, Guillermo.
You're welcome. I think we have another question from Mark Smith.
Good morning, Guillermo. Thanks a lot for this presentation. This is really helpful, putting all this in plain English. Hey, the part I don't understand is that I think in today's market, the transfers between EIM entities and the ISO as you said, offset in many cases the requirement. And so there is no presumed opportunity cost associated with meeting that requirement. Now, I think what you said is when you move to a full deliverability implementation this fall, that the treatment of those transfers changes. Now, I understand how you would need to enforce local constraints and in the nodal market that you're designing to ensure that everything is deliverable. But if there is capacity between the EIM entities, why wouldn't that also be considered and used in this new design?
Yeah, let me see if I can elaborate on that, and that's a very key question, Mark. The new design is not going to change the construct of the net import capability. That continues to exist just because of the way the mesh of the different balancing areas is taking place in the full EIM construct. What is going to change is how we account for that in the formulation of the FRP explicitly. Right now, the current formulation is that we offset the requirement by the net import capability. That specific point of the design is not going to longer be in place with the new formulation because we are going to redesign the construct of the requirement. In general, what is going to happen now with the new formulation is that we are going to define, first, we are going to go through the testing, through the resource efficiency evaluation and see who passed, who failed. Now, those that pass the flex test are going to come together in one single bubble, and we are going to enforce the requirement for that single bubble. So anybody that is part of that bubble and that pass the test are going to be able to take advantage of the potential import capability that exists between them, but it's only within this smaller bubble. Those that fail the test are going to be holding a requirement by themselves. And we're going to ensure that there is a requirement for that individual area because they failed the test. That is really the change of the design. But when we move into this new formulation, there will be a requirement for this subset of areas that pass the test. And yes, if there are some transfer capability within those areas, they can be fully utilized. And therefore, there is no differentiation between the capacity that can be procured from one area to another for those that are part of that subset of areas. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think what you're saying is that if you fail the resource sufficiency evaluation, imports will no longer be allowed to meet your FRP requirement. Is that right?
Yeah, because basically you have to meet it by yourself. You are on your own, basically, in the procurement of the FRP.
Very good. Thank you, Guillermo. That helps a lot.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Operator, do we have any other questions in the queue?
I do not see any other callers in the queue as of now.
Okay, let's move on then, please. And this is just to put all together, right? We understand that there are different concerns about prices, deliverability, utilization, requirements. The end result is that for whatever the driver or combination of the drivers is, the end result is that effectively the system may not have the ramp capability that is needed to tackle the realized uncertainty. That is the ultimate goal, to have the capacity to address uncertainty when it's realized. If the FRP is not giving that intended outcome, naturally we are going to still see that uncertainty is happening and we have to do something to overcome that complexity. One of the factor approaches that CAISO has been utilizing for some time is the utilization of the load conformance. This is an operator action that is taking place dynamically in the real-time market to position resources, to create a headroom on the resources to ensure that we are able to handle the uncertainty when that materializes. And just to illustrate that in dynamic, here you have a trend of the load conformance that has been applied historically for the last 3 years and a couple of months in 2022 in the hourly ahead scheduling process, the HASP process. And this is just a very typical box plot illustration. The box captures basically the 25 to the 75 percentiles. The dots are any outliers that are beyond the length of 1.5 times the interquantile. And the black dots that you have inside the box is the simple average, just to give you a reference of, on average, what the value would be. It's important to give you also the spectrum, right? And that is the reason we use this box plot. And we can see that in the hash market, it's quite significant. There are some cases that you can see we reach a load conformance of up to 3,000 megawatts. And it follows a very well-defined shape that follows, to some extent, the net load shape of the market, right? We have two humps, one in the morning, one in the afternoon. There is not much to be done in the middle of the day when we have plenty of renewable energy, and it goes up to the highest value when we are across the growth of the net load peak. And this is how operators are trying to position resources to gain that headroom that is needed to absorb the uncertainty that we know is going to realize from time to time. And I would say that in concept, once we have a more efficient FRP performance, one consequence that we could see happening is that the utilization of this load conformance may decrease over time. Next slide, please. And just to put a closure on this discussion, this just gives you a very simple line items of the issues that we have been addressing since we implemented the FRP model in 2016, and the issues that are still present. And we have a lot of expectations that with the fall release 2022, many of those issues are going to be addressed. And granted, we have to continue to assess how it performs once it's implemented. And we will continue to report on any performance that we identify either before the implementation under the current construct or moving forward with a new formulation. Let's take the question from Alba before we move to the next topic, please.
Sure. Please go ahead, the line is unmuted.
Thank you. Guillermo, just a quick question following up on I believe it was Carrie, I'm not sure. But the requirement that you've implemented now for storage on flexible ramping, is it the same as the requirement that's implemented for ancillary services, a 1/2 hour buffer on state of charge, or is there a different requirement? Because I haven't seen documentation of that specific change.
Sorry, Alba, I couldn't follow your question. I don't know if when you talk about requirements, you're talking about FRP requirements or something else. Can you please help me to unpack this a little bit?
Sorry, it sounded like you were saying that the battery's capability to deliver flexible ramping would be based on its state of charge. And currently, ancillary services require 1/2 hour of state of charge or state of charge margin, depending on the direction. Yeah. Is it the same requirement for flexible ramping?
I will have to go back to you to know specifically if it is a 30-minute or not. I remember the enhancements that we did was to ensure that for the amount of FRP procurement that we wanted to award to that resource, there should be enough state of charge to hold that. But I don't think it's defined to be on a 30-minute like the yes or not. I can go back and ensure I give you a more precise answer.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That's it.
Thank you. I think we have one more question from Carrie, operator.
Hi, this is Carrie Bentley, again with the Western Power Trading Forum. Thanks, Guillermo, for walking through this. On your last slide, you showed, I think, that half biasing is going up over time. So would you agree that the goal of implementing FRP to reduce half biasing has not been achieved? Is that the main takeaway here?
I would generally agree with you, yes. Now, for the hash market, I think it's a more clear picture because obviously the hash market is the look-ahead market, right? That is when we have the last opportunity to clear interties. That is one of the reasons we heavily rely on this load conformance. And yes, as long as we have this much load bias, it's a symptom that obviously something in the market construct that we currently have is not working as we wish. And in this case, it's effectively the FRP. Now, I wouldn't generalize this across the board because you may also realize that we have load conformance applicable to FMM and to the 15-minute market and to the 5-minute market. And in the report, I believe I put some information regarding the 5-minute load bias. And I would say, even if you have a very well-functioning FRP product, I wouldn't foresee that the load forecast is going to be completely eliminated, because the truth is that even when you have that ramp capability set properly to deal with uncertainty, there are other drivers that may lead to the utilization of the load conformance. And effectively, for instance, the easiest one to refer is what happens in the 5-minute market. This is really to true up imbalances that happen in the system, not necessarily uncertainties for load, wind, and solar, right? There may be some component there, but there are other type of imbalances like resource deviations, pumps, or any other resource lagging or coming late to ramp, or changes with the interchange balance. There are other factors that have to be true up. So I would expect that if we have in this ideal concept the FRP working as intended, yes, we should see a diminished utilization of the load conformance, but in some cases like the conformance in RTD, that may continue to happen to some extent.
That makes sense to me. Yeah, I never expected FRP to eliminate biasing, but I guess I expected a bigger impact even on HASP. And I'm wondering why we aren't seeing that. And when you go to your next slide, you have remaining issues to be resolved. And because these slides were after each other, I kind of thought I would see on this list HASP biasing, and then a solution to be implemented to at least reduce some of the systemic biasing. So I'm wondering if any of the solutions that are going to be implemented, whether you think that will impact HASP biasing, or whether that's another issue we should add to this list.
Yeah, and I would say we are taking this approach of wait and see, right? Because we have a lot of expectations on the performance of FRP. Once we take this out of the way, we can really find out if there is any other condition that is leading to the utilization of HASP conformancy. FRP is already giving us what we expect to have. So I would say that the natural progression of this is going to be that once we have the new formulation in place, we're going to start assessing what is pending, what is still missing if we continue to see the utilization to this extent of load conformance. It's a step-by-step approach, I believe, just given the complications that you don't know really at this point to the extent the FRP is driving the load conformance completely, or there may be other underlying factors that once you eliminate one of the components, it becomes more obvious and visible what else is pending to be addressed.
Okay, thanks, Guillermo. I mean, I think that wait and see approach typically works for impacts on the broader market, but HASP biasing is due to operator action. So it seems like you could ask the operators whether these solutions and whether if they could rely on FRP more would reduce their biasing. I think it would. Does that make sense? Like, I just think it would be, this is a major issue that hasn't been resolved in 4 years and is getting worse. So it seems like maybe we could do some work in advance of implementing these to see if they would impact biasing.
No, yeah, I see your point, Carrie, and I can tell you, what we're going to hear is that it's the uncertainty that they have to deal with, right? Because they don't know how things are going to happen after the fact, and if they miss the train of the HASP market, they may be in a position that they have no more levelers to pull and push. So we know it's driven by the uncertainty. The piece I'm trying to unpack here is that once you know that it's impacted because of the lack of efficiency in the FRP procurement, what else is pending there, right? If we understand now that the FRP is going to really give us the headroom that is needed, that is going to naturally raise the question of what else is missing, what else is giving this uncertainty to continue to utilization of the load conformance. So we know is the uncertainty that is driving all this.
Thanks, Guillermo. That's helpful. And then one final question, and I think we've asked for this before. Have you guys ever looked at the efficacy or the reasonability of the bias? So in an instance where operators bias 2,000 megawatts, is that actually needed or not? It seems like that would help you tease out what is FRP uncertainty, what is other uncertainty, and then what is just maybe excess biasing that really doesn't need to be there and can be maybe systemically retrained out of the operators.
Yeah, no, that's a good point, Carrie, that we can take in moving forward. We have tried in different ways to do that, and obviously one of the complications is that there is a natural sequencing, right? And for instance, let's assume we have a load conformance of, I don't know, 2,000 megawatts. What do operators get out of that 2,000 megawatts? Well, the implications could be that results in bringing, I don't know, 300 additional imports on the hourly interties. It may result on additional 500 EIM transfers coming from the different balancing areas. It may result in 1,500 megawatts of moving internal resources up. And out of these 1,500 megawatts of resources, internal resources moving up, maybe 300 are because they are starting up new resources, right? So when you break down what you gain out of that load bias, you can see what is materially impactful. Effectively, new commitments, because we know that they're going to be there now. Additional imports, because we know that was the last time to secure that additional interties. The rest is like a balancing account, right? Yeah, we have resources moving up, but moving up one resource in the HAS market doesn't imply much for the actual RTD market, right? Because when you go into the RTD market, if HAS determined to increase that resource by 100 megawatts, now when we don't have that much additional demand in the RTD market, the resource may be not really following that extra 100 megawatts, right? So it's more than one dimension of the problem, because there are different ways how you can meet that additional load bias. So in terms of what effectively you gain, it's just a small set of those megawatts gained by intertie capacity and by commitment. Anything else is like advisory. They can be reoptimized in subsequent runs, in the subsequent FMM or RTD runs. And this, I would challenge a little bit, that they are kind of advisory. They are going to be bought back eventually in the RTD market. So we start to do actually some type of this analysis along the way for the resource efficiency evaluation to try to dissect what really is the load bias giving us. And for that, obviously, we have to do some counterfactual assessment. So it's a good point, and I think as we discuss this more on the resource efficiency evaluation, we're going to gain more transparency of effectively what is gained by having these load conformances.
Yeah, thank you, Guillermo. And that makes complete sense to me, particularly if you commit resources at PMIN and then you have that excess bids on the system, the price will drop. And so now those resources, that it shifts the entire flows because you've now bid in a way to, yeah, I get it. That sounds very complicated, but I am encouraged that you're looking into it.
Yeah, thank you. We have one more question from Dan Williams, and maybe we can take just this last question to be able to move forward, please.
Hi, Guillermo. Thanks. Dan Williams from Customized Energy Solutions. Just a really quick follow-on to your conversation with Carrie, and that's just to identify the tie-in here of intertie market liquidity and sort of the health and function of the CAISO's intertie market. I know we'll be discussing sort of how the HAS biasing interacts with EIM advisory transfers, but I think it'd be good too to look at some data in when the operators are trying to use bias to induce more hourly block intertie imports into the market, what's actually available there? And if that availability is diminishing over time, why? To kind of get into some root cause analysis for what's actually going on. I think that's especially important to consider as we look at a potential EDAM future where the intertie market would be changed significantly and where this HAS tool would, or the bias tool would sort of no longer have the opportunity to be drawing in those intertie transfers. So just be in a different paradigm depending on how the market develops. So just a few things to think about there, I guess, as we continue analysis on this.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very good line of thought. We will consider that. Okay, I don't know if Alva still has a question or is just from the previous round. Okay, good. Let me move quickly to the rest of the topics. Congestion revenue rights. We have continued to report on this. I would say it has been stable for a while, but we always keep an eye on how the performance of the CRR market is. And there are some standard metrics that we have reported and we will continue to report in terms of the overall settlement. And this one is just giving you the trend that once we pass the summer, naturally the volume, the size of the market reduces just because we are less constrained, there is less congestion in the system, and that's expected. We continue to see some level of deficiency in the CRR settlements, and that's still expected because it's constraint specific. And there is really not much to highlight from this, rather than as we go out of the summer conditions, the size of the CRR market naturally reduces. Next slide, please. This is a counterfactual that we have been doing just to assess the size of the implication by having the pro rata funding versus the prior model that we have of full funding. And effectively, the delta between the green and the blue bars tells you the level of the change once we have implemented the pro rata funding. If we were having the full funding, effectively, we would have, in several cases, even as we enter in the winter season, some significant level of underfunding. As we move to the pro rata funding, this is naturally offset by the new logic that we have, and effectively it turns to be a positive value that is eventually the dollars allocated to the measured demand. Next slide, please. This is the typical CRR auction efficiency. We realize we didn't update this for the last 2 months, but overall the picture is as usual. We continue to see the CRR auction efficiency in the same ballpark between 50% to 100%, and we have some jumps here and there, but it has been relatively steady for the last few months. Next slide, please. Now, there is one item I would like to highlight, and that is not the typical metric that we present. And I understand there has been some concerns raised by specific participants potentially impacted by this condition. The concern is not new. I think we have assessed this in the past because we saw the dynamic. And the consequence of this dynamic is that there are some constraints, and typically, it is not all the time, but typically, is going to happen for relatively small size constraints, such that when we account for the contributions of flows from the different locations, including or potentially not accounting for the contribution of the major aggregated locations, such as the trading hubs and the D-labs, we see this dynamic in which we have certain logic currently in the energy market, in which we only account for the flow contributions as long as that specific location has effectiveness, meaning a shift factor of at least 2%. That is a logic that we have had since day one of the MRTU. Once we have this cutoff threshold of 2%, there will be very interesting dynamics when we go into the settlements of the CRR, because CRR settlements under the new paradigm relies obviously in the shift factors. And when we have this combination of relatively small constraints with significant effect of the labs and trading hubs, and they happen to be with a relatively small effectiveness under 2%, we end up with this condition in which the revenues collected in the energy market is not going to be enough for the relative revenues that are needed for the CR settlement. Next slide, please. And what you see as an end result is that the notional value of the CRRs may be actually lower, or let me put it the other way around. The amount of the offset revenue calculated for some specific constraints may be greater than the notional revenue estimated for those CRR setters on that specific constraint. And that is kind of counterintuitive, because obviously if we are saying that the notional value for one constraint is a given dollar, we are saying that once we apply the pro rata funding, it's going to not only fully exhaust that dollar, but also going to switch the direction because the offset is greater than the notional value. And we discussed this to some extent back in 2020. And this is the interplay effectively of having this shift factor threshold, because once we apply that, there is contribution not accounted for in the CRR settlement. Next slide, please. And what you would see is that there is a divergence. When you compare that in dollar-wise or megawatt-wise, you see this divergence. One is the estimated energy market condition versus the other one that is the CRR estimated condition. And in this case, the comparison is for megawatts. And you can see that divergence. And effectively, that divergence, that delta between the two lines, is driven by this lack of contribution, lack of accounting of the effect of the labs and trading hubs into the flow of that specific constraint. Next slide, please. Okay, before we move into this, and I see we have a question, the idea here is that we understand this dynamic, and the shift factor threshold is a provision that we currently have in the tariff, and we were intending to pursue an enhancement to address this shift factor threshold interplay, and then we get busy with the summer conditions. And I have indicated to specific people that have been asking about this condition. What I can tell you is that we have reached the point where we have done some assessment, and we are moving forward with a formal stakeholder initiative. That should come publicly available in a matter of 1-2 weeks. We are finalizing the issues paper to be posted. And the idea here is that we have to undertake a formal stakeholder initiative because in order to change the current logic of the shift factor threshold applicable to these trading hubs and the labs, we have to change the tariff. That is a provision that is crystal clear and well defined in the tariff. So in order for us to do the change, we have to change the tariff. And in order to change the tariff, we have to go through a formal process to give the opportunity to have that and discussion with the stakeholders. The expectation is that we're going to move forward with that initiative. Is going to be coming in a matter of 1 or 2 weeks. And from there, we are just going to go through the process, post the issues paper, get the feedback, make a proposal, get the feedback, and if there is still lingering questions or issues on that area, we may have one more round of the stakeholder process. I expect this could be a very expedited process. I think everyone recognizes it's not an ideal outcome, but I would like to ensure that we run through the errands of a more formal stakeholder procedure because of the implications of having to go and change the tariff. So we have to have a robust process to address this change. And let me pause here, and I think we have a couple of questions on the line. So can we go first with Mohammed, please, operator?
Sure. Please go ahead, the line is unmuted.
Hi, Guillermo. This is Mohammed Kara with the FNY. Thank you for your presentation. My main question here is you have in the previous slide, there was a comparison for between the IFM flow, and you were talking about the DLAB contribution, and since the DLAB is below 2%, I'm curious to know if we are taking into account the FLABs as well, or are we only considering the DLABs? Because for that constraint, PGEP FLAB, has a 7% plus shift factor on the constraint?
Yeah, that's a good question. And overall, the logic that we have is that we have the effectiveness estimated for every single location relative to that constraint. The shift factor threshold applies across the board, so any location that falls under this threshold is not going to be contributing to the flow. And it doesn't matter if it is a trading hub or a sub-lab or an individual resource location. As long as it is below the threshold, it's not going to be accounted for. The reason I highlight with emphasis the labs and the trading hubs is because of the magnitude, right? When we talk about 2% for a specific resource, let's say of 100 megawatts, 2% is like 2 megawatts, right? When we talk about trading hubs and D-labs, let's say the D-lab for PG&E is 10,000 megawatts. Well, 2% of 10,000 megawatts is what? 200 megawatts? And that is significant. When we are talking about a constraint that may have a limit of, let's say, 50 megawatts, and we are cutting off the contribution of the D-labs of 2% on 10,000 megawatts, well, that is way larger than the whole size of the constraint. That is the reason I put emphasis that we need to really tackle the D-labs and the trading hubs just because of the relative size and how they can meaningfully impact a small constraints, even though it's a 2% threshold. And I'm trying to, I may be already going into what we're proposing, but part of the discussion we had back in 2020 is that the proposal we're envisioning is to reduce the shift factor threshold specifically for these meaningful aggregated locations such as the labs and trading hubs. And if there are other meaningful constraints that are impacted by other smaller aggregated locations or even individual locations, I think that will be part of the discussion we can have in the stakeholder process.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for the question. We have one more question from another person, please.
Yes, please go ahead. Tal Levi, I've unmuted your line. Please go ahead.
Thank you. This is Tal with Appian Away again. To follow up on Mohammed's question, essentially the S-labs are a subset of the D-lab. So does all load settle at the D-lab and not the S-lab? So that essentially if a constraint binds and it has shift factors less than 2% in all the D-labs, is it guaranteed not to be collecting any revenue from load, even if it has a higher shift factor on an S-lab?
Well, I would say every resource is settled, right? And every resource that we model in the market and has a location and a shift factor is going to contribute to the constraint. And even if it is a sub-lab within a bigger D-lab, the fact that they are two individual IDs or two individual variables, each one is going to have its own shift factor. So in this case, there will be a shift factor for a custom lab, but also a shift factor for the corresponding D-lab. And each one on its own are going to have their own contribution to the flow on a given constraint.
I don't think that's the case, though. I mean, the S-labs are a subset of the D-lab load, if I'm not mistaken. So I doubt you're double counting in the market flows. And then from the settlement perspective, if, let's say, the S-lab is 1 gigawatt and the D-lab is 10, does that 1 gigawatt settle at the S-lab shift factor, or is it calculated just as part of the broader D-lab?
Yeah, I'm not very familiar with the settlement of the specific custom lab, so I will have to take this back and get back to you on how we settle the labs, custom labs. Yeah,
that'd be helpful. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And Guillermo, I see one more caller in the phone queue. Would you like to take that question as well?
Yes, please.
Okay, sure. Please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Hey, Guillermo, Mike Ramick with the Boston Energy. I just have a question on the prior slide 29. You may have answered it, but I just want to ask it again. So my understanding of this constraint is that the CRR flow appears to be into the load center, and the IFM flow is actually negative, which means it's flipped. Is that because you exclude and the line limit is like 120 megawatts, I believe, on the constraint? So is that strictly because you exclude the PG&E load because of the threshold, and therefore that actually flipped the flow from into, I believe this is Oakland area, to out of Oakland area because of excluding the PG&E load contribution? Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, I appreciate that. Well, this is an interesting case, but thank you much.
You're welcome.
I do not see any other callers in the queue as of now.
Okay, let's move on quickly on this. I think we're running way behind scale, but I appreciate the discussion. This is really the purpose of having this type of discussions, and I apologize for having limited time to address all the questions. This is a very quick update. We have, as you may recall, the implementation of policy back in February 2021, and that was for addressing intertie deviations. We call this the intertie deviation settlements. And effectively, what we are trying to achieve with this is to incentivize intertie resources to deliver. After they have cleared in the market, we expect that they deliver. And when that doesn't happen under this new construct, there will be some penalties assessed based on the settlements of that deviation. And these are settled based on the real-time prices. What you have here in the next few slides is just the trends of how the intertie deviation settlements has been playing since we implemented that. And please take consideration that this is based on settlements data. This is preliminary data that may still be changing over time. And this just gives you the sense of the dollar magnitude of the intertie deviation. And you can see that in July, we have some significant dollar amounts there exceeding the $4 million mark. And naturally it subsides through the rest of the year. It's expected that under lighter conditions, we don't have too much issues in the deviation. We have plenty of supply. Next slide, please. This is the energy trend. Is over the month, total megawatt hours sum up over the month. And just to give you a sense, you have July, and that is about, 80,000 megawatt hours for the month. You divide that by 30 days by 24 hours, you can get a sense of the average megawatt deviation that we have for the month. Next slide, please. And this gives you a snapshot over time. We know that on the month we have some significant volume, but if you go through the hourly profile, where in the month we see the most significant deviations. And expectedly, this is happening mostly in the summer conditions. You can see that we have June, July to be the most significant deviations, and they happen to be across the gross or the net peak, and that is where the main concern is, because that is where they may have the most significant impact in the operation of the system. We may be missing the megawatts when they are the most needed. Next slide, please. Price of cost. Let me quickly move on this one as well. This is just to give you a sense of how the 2021 was relative to previous years. And the overall wholesale market cost includes the different settlements that we have: the day ahead, the real time, energy and services, the reliability must run, even the GMC. We include that to give you a wholesale reference cost. Next slide, please. And this is just a quarterly trend over the last 3 years or so. And you can see that 2021 was relatively higher than 2020. I would say comparable to 2018, and it's quite volatile. Right? It depends on the loading conditions, on the pricing that we see based on other factors such as gas prices. So it's expected that it's going to be quite a variable from year to year. Next slide, please. Well, sorry, can we go back one slide? I just missed the point here that in 2021, we can see that it was significantly higher than 2020. You put a dollar figure here. We are talking that in 2020, the overall wholesale cost was about $8.8 billion. And 2021 is in the range of $12 billion. That is kind of a solid increase of 43%. And if we want to further understand why that increase in costs happened in 2021, the next slide, please, is going to show to some extent what happened here. Very interesting enough to see that once we reach the summer time frame, June, the costs remain quite high, and they typically subside through the end of the year, but they remain quite high even after the summer. And here you have two trends. One is the prices in the market. You can see that even after June, they hold steady, they hold in a very high range. And part of that has to do with the gas dynamics. And you can see, for instance, if you put aside February, that was the outlier because of the weather conditions, effectively since May, we have seen a steady increasing trend of the gas prices, and they stay there. I would say typically we have seen prices in the neighborhood of $3 per MMBTU. Well, the second half of 2021, you can see that those prices stay in the range of at least $5 per MMBTU, not just in the southern part of the system, but also in the northern part of the system. So it's signaling a more systemic condition that naturally is going to reflect in the electric prices because we're still with meaningful amount of gas generation. And once you have these higher prices, effectively they are going to drive the overall cost of the market. Next slide, please. This is just the same trend broken out by average demand, just to see that demand has not been significantly different to previous years. It's really more about the price at which the demand is settled. Next slide, please. Okay, let me hand it over to Quinn to cover a little piece of storage. Storage obviously is a very interesting topic. It's a timely topic given all the high penetration that we have of the resources in the system. And we just want to give you some snapshot of how recently the trends are looking like. Okay. Thank you.
Guillermo. Yes, so in this section, we will talk about the performance of battery resources for the past few months. For batteries, we track two main metrics. One is the state of charge, or SOC. That's the amount of energy stored in batteries in unit megawatt hour. And number two, market worth in dispatch in unit megawatt. We start by showing the hourly distribution of SOC in ISM market per month from September 2021 to end of February 2022. Each plot here shows the hourly trend of 1 month, and each vertical bar, the vertical box plot, is the distribution of that hour. We can see that SOC reaches maximum levels mostly in hour ending 15, 16, and 17. That's right on time to be fully available for the afternoon peak and night hours when the sun is down. Next slide, please. So cross to the real-time side. This is the, again, hourly distribution of SOC in RTD for the same month. Real-time shows a similar trend as day ahead, and there may be some specific measures such as the spread of the distributions may be slightly different depending on the specific conditions in real time, but the overall shape across the hours behave the same way. So SOC peaks right before the afternoon peak hours. Next slide, please. Now, switching to the megawatt side. Here we're looking at the hourly distribution of IFM schedules in megawatt. We can see how nicely this shape is tracking the net load, the duck curve we have. The storage resources are charging during the day when it is the most economical and discharging mostly for the evening peak when the system is tight with a high price signal. So this is the exact behavior we expect to see for storage resources. Next slide, please. Crossing over to the real-time side. Again, the real-time dispatch follows the same trend as the day-ahead one. The highest dispatches are in our ending 18 through 21. And by last month, February 2022, the highest dispatch was up around 1,500 megawatt. That means we're observing an increasingly significant share of battery resources participating in the market. Yeah, next slide, please. So this plot illustrates the hourly average AS awards for the past 6 months from IFM Solutions. Batteries continue to provide mostly regulations up and down throughout the day. We have some small numbers of spin visible. And looking more closely, by the end of last summer, say September-October timeframe, the highest reg up was around 1,000 megawatt, and the highest reg down was slightly over 1,000 megawatt. Now, by beginning of this year, so January 2022 and February 2022, the max levels of reg up was around and over 2,000 megawatt, while the highest reg down was over 2,500 megawatt, and in some cases close to 3,000 megawatt. Next slide, please. So this next set of slides will zoom in to look at AS awards specifically. To see where storage resources stand in the market over time, we're looking at AS awards by resource composition in the market. So here we're looking at the average monthly IFM AS awards from January 1st, 2021 to January 31st, 2022 to cover a bit more than a full year. Each plot shows the trend of one commodity type. So we have reg up, reg down, spin, and non-spin here. And each vertical bar represents the data for 1 month. And then we also have the fuel types by color. So red is for gas, blue for water, and green for battery. As we can see, the storage resources have been consistently providing reg up and reg down and a small amount of spin. Next slide, please. So switching to the hourly view, now the x-axis is 24 hours. This is the average AS awards by resource type again. The highest reg up was right before the afternoon peak hours, and the highest reg down was mostly during late morning to early afternoon hours. Next slide, please. So now, pulling out the storage resources, the LESR type alone. This is the monthly distribution of the IFM AS awards for storage resources over the 13-month period. And each vertical bar, box plot represents the distribution of 1 month. And each data point is the total AS awards from storage resources in that hour. So as we can see, sorry, can I go back? Yeah, as we can see, there's a notable increase in regulation procurement end of last year, so December 2021 to January 2022. And before November 2021, the IFM regulation awards were mostly below 500 megawatts. And in January 2022, the peak was reaching around 1,000 megawatts. Next slide, please. The hourly distribution. So crossing to the hourly side, again, we're seeing that reg up awards reaches the highest levels before the afternoon peak hours and start to trend down afterwards. Reg down is high in the, again, late morning to early afternoon hours. Next slide, please. Here's the last two slides. So the last two slides of this section will zoom in further to look at the share of storage resources in regulation. The percentage share of storage resource is defined as the total market awards from LES resource type divided by total market requirement of that commodity. So say Reg Up has a market requirement of 100 megawatt, and RU awards from storage resources from up to 70 megawatts. Then the share of storage resource of RU requirement is then 70%. As shown here, the share of storage resource in Reg Up went from below 100% before November 2021 to over 200% at times in December 2021 and January 2022. We can also see an increase in share in Reg Down from below 70% to around 90%. When the share reaches close to and above 100% by January 2022, we say that the storage resources have saturated the regulation market. And next slide, please. So one last time, turning into the hourly view, the saturation of the regulation market, more so for the Reg Up side, is more pronounced in late hours of the day. So from the afternoon peak through the end of the day. So that's the end of this section. We can take any questions if there's any.
Yes, I do see two callers, one in the WebEx queue, another one on the phone queue. Moving on to the WebEx caller, please go ahead, your line is unmuted.
So this is Elvis Svoboda from PG&E. I want to appreciate very much your sharing this information about the ancillary services. I had asked Guillermo about this, and this is really helpful. I wanted you to go back to the very first slide you had on the ancillary services. It was, can't tell if the number was, I think it was like 45 or something like that. But let's see. We're not the energy, but the ancillary services. So maybe
a couple more.
Here, no. You had one where you were showing. Okay, I think it's this one. So you're showing an average of 3,000 megawatts of Reg Down in over a month, which would mean that the average amount of Reg Down that was procured from batteries in that hour was over 3,000 megawatt. Was 3,000 megawatts, some hours above and some hours below. Is that what you're saying? So essentially, the Reg Down requirement was over 3,000 megawatts on average in hour ending 9 in February?
This is the Reg Down procurement, so we're not showing the requirement on this chart.
Okay, so you're procuring above 100%?
Reg Down.
I can help here, Quinn.
Sure.
One of the complications, Alba, is that, and this is really linking to the last two slides that we have in the presentation for batteries, is that given the construct that we have for AES, there will be cases in which we can procure more than 100% of one service from different resources, because we have this rational buyer cascading logic. For instance, let's say your requirement for regulation is 500 and your requirement for a spinning reserve is, I don't know, another 400. Right. If you have plenty of capacity to procure your regulation and in excess, such as is cheap enough, you can procure, for instance, the 500 megawatts for regulation plus extra 200 of regulation to meet a lower quality AES, such as a spin or non-spin. We allow this cascade. So effectively, when you see, you can do the accounting that is procuring excess of regulation, but the excess is to meet a lower quality service, such as a spin. And that is the linkage here, that there may be cases where we procure more than the requirement, not because we are procuring an excess, but because it's utilized to procure another lower quality service.
that would make sense in the reg up direction. I don't think there's any cascading in the reg down direction.
All right, this is only in the upward direction. Yeah. I see your point. Yeah. Let us go back. I think that 3,000 megawatts seems to be just too high.
Right. Yeah. And I was also interested in, I think you explained it in the upward direction further on that you're procuring like 1,000 megawatts of reg up, when I think the requirement on reg up tends not to be that high. On the reg down, you've got very high reg down requirements, but your reg up requirements haven't grown as much, and yet you're showing higher procurement. But what you say about cascading does make sense there. So I'd like to look further into this, but really appreciate your sharing this information. It's very helpful. Thank you.
Okay. I do see a couple of callers in the phone queue. Would you like to take those questions?
I'm afraid that we are running very tight, and we need to give time to the other topics that are equally important. So if there are any questions, we will be happy to follow up on the side, but I would really like to move to the policy update.
Okay, sure.
Good morning, this is Brad Cooper. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so this is the policy update. I go over the status of our various market initiatives. I included in here our updated roadmap. We posted the final updated roadmap slides based on feedback we got after we presented this to our board and the EM governing body. On this slide, I'll just point out a couple things. I'd note that this is missing the upcoming initiative addressing shift factors that Guillermo mentioned, because that's a relatively new thing. And then there was also an initiative that was real quick, relatively minor, addressing the short start and long start unit definitions that we recently filed at FERC. That fit in here right at the beginning of the year. And I would note on this slide, because I don't have an individual slide about it, the price formation enhancements initiative, where we're planning to look at improving scarcity pricing provisions in our market, also looking at fast start pricing, and then some pricing issues related to storage. That will be coming up in the near future. We're currently targeting a issue paper in May. And then moving down, I'd note that this is different. Based on feedback, we've moved up the start of the resource sufficiency evaluation phase 2 initiative. We recently wrapped up the phase 1. Before we were talking about also a phase 1B initiative. We're still working on that, but things were getting overly complicated with all the phases. So we're just calling our further efforts on resource sufficiency evaluation phase 2. And I have some more detail on that coming up. So next slide. And actually, I don't think I have much to say on this slide. I think this is actually pretty unchanged from slides we've been presenting on our upcoming roadmap. So I won't go over anything on this. I just included this for completion. The Interconnection Process Enhancements Initiative, or otherwise known as the ICE initiative, is making various changes to our generator interconnection and deliverability allocation procedures. It's basically focused on the enhancements to address the huge queue interconnection queue overload we're experiencing, and then some further enhancements to further modify the interconnection process to focus on the realities of how the procurement of new resources happening today. In these slides, we always review the WEIM governing body's role. This initiative, since it has to do with CAISO BAA's interconnection process, would be under only the CAISO board. We posted a draft final proposal on phase 1 on March 17th. And comments are due today on that, and that's planned to go to this upcoming May board meeting. And then the second phase of the initiative, or phase 2, they're planning on a draft final proposal in June for that phase, and then that's targeting or planned for the November CAISO board meeting. Next slide, please. The reliability demand response resource bidding enhancements, or RDRR bidding enhancements, funniest market products we have in the market, RDRR, little joke, is looking at sort of relatively minor enhancements to RDRR bidding. The first track was aligning RDRR bidding with the new provisions of our market that we implemented in conjunction with FERC Order 831, where our bid cap and the price of our power balance constraint, the pricing run, can toggle between $1,000 and $2,000. So that phase addressed how RDRRs bid under the when the $2,000 price cap is in. The second track is looking at how you handle minimum load costs and minimum load for, and it's not really minimum load, it's, more correctly, it's kind of a minimum dispatch for RDRR resources, and then a change to the discrete dispatch option cap that currently exists on RDRR. This initiative, that WEIM governing body role, is joint authority, even though RDRRs currently are only in the CAISO BAA, the functionality could potentially be used by a WEIM balancing authority area if their local regulatory authority approved it or decided they wanted to implement something like that. So the track 1 was approved at the March joint board and governing body meeting, and then it was actually we subsequently filed that already at FERC in March. And then the track 2 draft final proposal was posted on March 11th, and we recently got comments on that. That's currently planned for the May joint board and WEIM governing body meeting. Though there's a potential we might hold that off to the next meeting, but we're still talking about that internally. But the current plan is May. Next slide. The resource sufficiency evaluation enhancements, phase 2, this is referring to the resource sufficiency evaluation that we have in the WEIM. It's looking at, or has been looking at, well, the resource sufficiency evaluation Enhancements Initiative in general has been looking at various changes to the EIM's resource efficiency evaluation. We had completed phase 1 late last year and filed that with FERC. Phase 2 will look at some further enhancements. I won't read them all, but they're listed here. And this is under the WEIM governing body's joint authority with the board. The status of this is we're starting off phase 2 with various analyses on the performance of the resource sufficiency evaluation. The first workshop is actually going to be tomorrow on effective load conformance, on how load conformance affects transfers in the WEIM, and then also on the interaction of the various uncertainty calculations we do as part of the resource sufficiency evaluation. We also had a workshop on a potential mechanism for using the WEIM for calling it emergency assistance here, or in other words, is a mechanism to allow further transfers into a WEIM balancing authority area, even in intervals or hours when they failed the resource sufficiency evaluation. We're getting comments on that workshop today, and then not today, tomorrow on it, and then we'll be examining those comments and thinking about the next step after that. And then on the rest of these issues listed above, following the workshops on looking at the various analyses, we're planning to then post a straw proposal on those issues in June. Next slide, please. The Energy Storage Enhancements Initiative is looking at various enhancements to more efficiently dispatch storage. The main thing we're looking at in this initiative is a new model for the state of charge to reflect, it provides a different means of bidding into the market for storage resources than the traditional dollars per megawatt hour bids that we have today for conventional generation, to address their operational realities. And then is looking at some other enhancements related to storage. This is joint authority of the governing body with the ISO board. We're getting comments in next Monday. At the last workshop, it was discussed that people wanted more time to talk about the straw proposal. So we're looking at a workshop coming up fairly soon. I don't believe we've released the date yet, but it will be. I think that announcement is coming out fairly quickly, and the workshop will be fairly soon. And then following that workshop, we're planning on the draft final proposal, and then still planning on the August board and governing body meeting, which is actually September 1st. Next slide, please. And I should add here that people are wondering about the order of these slides, these are roughly ordered in the order of when the initiatives will be completed and go for approval at the board and or the governing body. So just, yeah, I'm not trying to do these in order of priority or anything. The day-ahead market enhancements, we're looking at new, what we're terming imbalanced reserve product to reserve capacity for uncertainty, which would be co-optimized in the IFM. It's looking at replacing additional capacity that operators obtain today through RUC adjustments. You know, a little bit ago we were talking about HASP adjustments. They also do a similar thing in the day-ahead market to reserve additional capacity to account for uncertainty. This new product would move the procurement of that capacity into the IFM so it could be co-optimized with energy and also obtained more efficiently and precisely than the RUC adjustments. You know, it's similar to the adjustments made in the real-time market to create flexible ramping capacity. When the operators make RUC adjustments, RUC doesn't necessarily commit new resources. It may just give a schedule to resources that were already online as a result of the IFM, which doesn't result in any new capacity. The imbalanced reserves would more precisely procure that capacity as well as provide a number of other benefits. This initiative is also looking at, it says here, residual unit commitment process improvements. Basically, that is adding procurement of downward capacity to the residual unit commitment or RUC process, which currently only procures upward capacity. This would be advisory to the governing body. We had a stakeholder workshop, or the last of a few workshops on March 2nd. We're planning a revised straw proposal on, this says April 6th. Plans changed a little since I posted these slides. We're actually moving that out about a week. The straw proposal will be posted on April 14th. And then we're looking at, this says mid to late CalISO board and governing body meeting. I believe our internal schedule says September, though, you know, this is very closely related to the extended day-ahead market initiative, and you know, there's the potential things could change as far as when we bring this for approval, depending on how the discussion of those issues are going in the extended day-ahead market initiative. Next slide, please. The resource adequacy enhancements phase 2 initiative, it's making or exploring making changes to align with the day-ahead market enhancements, with the creation of the imbalanced reserve products. We're exploring changing the obligations of resource adequacy resources to bid for imbalanced reserves, and we're also discussing whether they should bid a non-zero price, or we're also discussing whether they should bid a non-zero price for RUC capacity once day-ahead market enhancements and extended day-ahead market are implemented. And this initiative is also looking at some changes to the must-offer obligations for storage and what are called conditionally available resources. This initiative, I don't want to say it's on hold, but we haven't had a lot of activity on the initiative lately because it is so intertwined with the day-ahead market enhancements initiatives. So what we're planning is to put out a revision or the revised straw proposal in May, after we've put out our latest day-ahead market enhancements proposal and gotten feedback on that. And then we're planning for a Q3 board meeting, or more appropriately, it would be something in conjunction with the day-ahead market enhancements initiative, or in coordination with the approval of the day-ahead market enhancements initiative. Next slide, please. The Transmission Services and Market Scheduling Priorities Phase 2 initiative is looking at a process for wheeling transactions that go through the CAISO BAA to obtain high priority scheduling rights on a high priority scheduling rights on a forward basis. This would replace the temporary measures that we put in place last year, and then the phase 1 proposed extending. FERC approved that extension last March, and then the phase 2 process is going to kick back up again with the phase 2 process has had a number of workshops explaining other BAA's frameworks for releasing transmission for wheeling uses, and then we'll kick off the phase 2, continuing the phase 2 with the straw proposal in May, and then bring it for approval sometime late this year. And I guess I skipped over the EM governing body role. The EM governing body would have an advisory role in approving this initiative. And then finally, the next slide, please. And then finally, the Extended Day-Ahead Market Initiative, or EDAM, which obviously I'm sure everyone's familiar with this initiative since we've been working on it pretty intensely lately. It's looking at extending the day-ahead market to EIM entities. We haven't yet proposed a decisional designation as far as the EM governing body's role in this. We've recently completed the working group process, where we had numerous meetings with stakeholders talking over the various aspects of the design. We're looking at putting out the straw proposal the end of April, with the goal of completing it by the end of 2022. So I'll open it up for questions now.
Sure. As a reminder, if you're connected to the computer audio or use the Call Me feature in WebEx, you may enter the question queue by using the WebEx raise hand icon located just above the chat panel. You'll hear a beep tone when your line is unmuted. At that time, please state your name and question. If you're just on the phone line and not using the WebEx audio, please dial #2 on your telephone keypad to enter the question queue. You will hear a notification when your line is unmuted. At that time, please state your name and question. I do see one caller in the WebEx queue. Please go ahead, your line is unmuted.
Hi, Brad. Dan Williams from Customized Energy Solutions. This question's a bit of a segue into the TRAG's release planning presentation, but we've got a EIM GRC meeting starting up, so I wanted to make sure I got it while folks are still on the phone. I have lost track within any of the release planning materials or implementation milestones. What happened to the EIM base schedule submission window phase 2 implementation, moving from T-40 to T-30? That got pushed back last year and then was in the fall 2022 release, but somewhere in January or February, it seems to have completely fallen off the map. Do you have anything you can update us on for that implementation effort?
Yeah, I don't remember for sure, but I suspect, if you remember during that initiative, we committed to first looking at the impact of knowable, flexible ramping products, which was delayed. I think it was delayed kind of right after, just as that initiative was wrapping up, that was moved out, and now is planned to be implemented this fall. And so we might have delayed that until we implement nodal FRP and can be assured of the performance, but I'm not certain.
Yeah, if we could get some follow-up on that and maybe a stakeholder notice, that would be great. Just I know there were a number of EIM entities that was pretty important to, and implementation's already pretty far behind on it.
That's exactly right. This is Adrian Kiosia. That's exactly what Brad said. We need to do the FRP, and performance measurements in that project will probably bring clarity in the timing of this one. So thank you for that note. Probably we should add something, an announcement that will reach everyone interested on this one.
Yeah, because remember, because when we're to accommodate that T30, we have to shorten the time for one of the RTPD runs, or we had to shorten the time allowed for one of the RTPD runs during the hour to run. And there was the concern, I think it was our Market Surveillance Committee really was pointing out this concern that we really need to make sure nodal FRP is working right and the market can solve in that time before we move up the RSE. So we said we would check that first. Once the nodal FRP is implemented.
I'll try and leave it there, but just noting that there was a component of that tied in with the resource efficiency evaluation that was important to folks as well. And then just thinking about some of the discussion that Guillermo had this morning about FRP. I mean, there's a bit of a question about prioritization of which one might be bringing greater benefits to the market once implemented. But thanks for the update.
Yeah, and I'd note to add on to that discussion earlier, a good portion of the reason operators bias HASP in real time is because of the shortfalls in our FRP products, because a lot of the FRP is not deliverable because it's behind constraints. So they need to procure extra capacity to make sure they have enough capacity to respond to uncertainty. So the intent of nodal FRP is to correct that, which then, like Guillermo said, should reduce the biasing. There's other reasons they bias, but the intent of the FRP enhancements is to reduce the biasing. And I'd also note that the nodal FRP in our mind is very important because there's also an interaction between FRP pricing and energy pricing, and FRP serves as a scarcity pricing mechanism when we can't procure the full amount of energy and FRP, but because the market can always find FRP because it's not respecting constraints, that interaction between FRP and energy prices isn't what it should be. So FRP is a very high priority and it's very important to the market.
All good points, and maybe just part of the update could be, how long the CAISO thinks it's going to take in order to sort of assess that performance. Would we be looking at the base schedule submission window maybe being in the spring 2023 release, independent 2023 before next summer? Before summer of 2023, just to give folks an idea of what to expect there. Thanks, Seth.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
All right, thanks, Brad and Adrian and Dan for the question too. And we have taken the note for the BSSD or the T40, T30 timeline change to provide more information on that as well as the target timeline. Okay, so this is Trang Vo. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. All right, so we'll go ahead and start with the release plan update. Thanks all for joining us today. So we'll start with a new slide here that we wanted to add to provide more clarity of the transparency enhancements that are being implemented amongst various efforts. So again, we're committed to increasing transparency of data for our market participants, and that is in the form of enhancements that will be implemented or have been implemented amongst various projects. So this information you may have seen as part of specific project or initiative updates, but we wanted to provide a consolidated, centralized view, and we'll carry this on to the RUG and HUG to keep you updated on how these progress. So I'll start here and go down through the list of the different items and what to expect and what the next steps are. So we'll start with our CAISO website and transparency enhancements. So we had the publication of aggregate price taker wheel registration data and the aggregate RA showing import data for transmission service and market scheduling priorities, and those are already completed, and the data is posted on the CAISO website and is available now. As part of the phase 1 implementation for transmission service and market scheduling priorities, we have additional transparency items that are planned for pre-summer 2022 with the rest of the transmission service and market scheduling priorities implementation. So these two are for the publication of load forecast adjustments and load bias in OASIS, as well as the publication of curtailment data in OASIS. So those will continue further along through the implementation this summer by June 1st. And again, we'll have the milestones listed for each individual project as we normally do in the release update further along in the presentation. For resource efficiency evaluation, we have several enhancements, transparency items here as well. So for CMRI, we are providing resource-specific RSE capacity test data and flexible ramping test data. And then we also have OASIS scope for transparency for increasing the resource sufficiency evaluation data for RSE, and then also increasing the RSE data on RSE results. So these are in the form of new reports and interfaces that will be available for resource efficiency evaluation phase 1. And then I'll cover the last two items, and then we'll provide some more context around RSE. So for the last two items, we do have, as part of our summer readiness effort, CAISO website and today's Outlook and mobile app transparency scope for redesign of the existing capacity chart, and then also an addition of a separate line on the demand trend. So those two are planned for pre-summer 2022, and that is targeted for June 1st of this year. Okay. So before I open it up for any questions, I want to go back to RSE and elaborate a little bit more about these transparency enhancements for CMRI and OASIS as it pertains to the overall implementation of resource efficiency. So for resource efficiency, we have a June 1st target activation, and we do have some schedule changes on that initiative. So the priority for the ISO is to implement the core market functionality by June 1st. And to support that, then we are going to phase the OASIS availability, the CMRI and OASIS availability of the UI and the API, and we will announce the schedules for the availability of those components for CMRI and OASIS as we firm up the schedule. So again, just to reiterate for RSE, we are prioritizing that scope into 3 buckets overall for that effort, with the core market functionality going in on June 1st. and then the Oasis UI coming after that, and then the API to be made available for CMRI and Oasis as our third priority. And I'll open it up to Jamie to see if she wants to add anything to that.
Thank you, Trang. Good morning, everyone. This is Jamie Herget. I think you covered that really well. I just wanted to add, we understand the importance of these transparency items, and that, as we look through the critical path, when we got that together, it didn't land on June 1 for these transparency items. So we really have to protect all of our grid operations, ours and yours, in the summer conditions. So focusing on the core market engine to be done with a quality that's needed by June 1 really needs to be our focus. We would like to ensure we get the transparency items out there via the UI in that time frame, but we're still working through the schedule. There's really no slack in the schedule right now. But I think the highlight here today is that we are planning the APIs to be delivered as the third priority, and we would turn that right back around. I see that as a much lower risk item to go, mid-summer, as opposed to that core market engine. And that's really the essence behind it, and we wanted to just open that up to you and, in all transparency, and see if there are any questions or feedback on this.
Thank you, Jamie. I don't hear any questions, and again, we will continue to carry on.
Actually, I'm sorry to interrupt here, but I do see one caller in the queue who came in just now.
Sure.
Please go ahead, the line is unmuted.
Hi, Jamie. Hi, Trang. This is Chen Yung from PG&E. Yes, thank you for the communication about. Sounds like it's 3 steps: the core, then the UI, the API. I think one key question is how is the data, or how is the CAISO data interact between the systems if the API is not available? So, for example, if user need to enter something from the UI, and we'll say, I don't know in this case, is, for example, it's in cyber, and the information need to flow to downstream systems. So it's CAISO system, the data flow, and are they interact with each other? Or is that this API, trying to think, is this API is totally, it's just for external market participants?
Thank you, Chen. So, sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to take this for a moment because just to clarify for resource efficiency, when we're referring to the UI and the API, that is there aren't inputs from market participants on the CMRI and Oasis scope for RSE. So as far as the cyber change that you mentioned, that's scope for transmission service and market scheduling priorities. And at this point, we are still having transmission service and market scheduling priorities all go at the same time. For the UI and the API. So as far as phasing UI and API, that's just going to be for RSE at this point, and it will just be downstream and won't, so there won't be inputs from market participants to those systems. So that's to address, any submission concerns. Those don't apply necessarily for the UI and API for resource efficiency. And Jamie, I'll open it up to you. I think you had a comment as well.
I know you covered it. Thanks, Trang.
Okay, thanks. So, Chenyu, does that help, or do you have follow-up questions?
Oh, yeah, that really helps. So between the CMRI and Oasis, is there any system interaction for the RSE? Just trying to see whether if data need to be flowed between the two systems, whether those information will be flowed through between the CAISO internal systems. We're just really trying to understand if this API is purely just the API that it's being available to the market participants.
Sure. So the additional data that's being provided in the new CMRI, the one new CMRI report and two new OASIS reports for RSC are fed by the market. And so the market changes will continue to go in and send data downstream. And then when CMRI and OASIS are available, then they will consume that in the back end. Now, when we make the UI available first, then the data that will flow from the market will be available in those reports in the UI. And then when the API is available, that same data will be available in the API as well. So first we'll have the market data that will be adjusted to send to CMRI and OASIS, and you won't see that in these new reports until after we implement it in the UI. But once that integration is set up from the beginning from market to CMRI and OASIS, it'll be exposed in the UI and the API. The same data or payloads from market will show up in the UI and the API. It's just that we'll release those two interfaces separately.
That helps. That information helps a lot. Thank you, Trang.
Okay, thank you. All right, any other questions or comments on this? And okay, so we'll go ahead and move on, and please do stop me for any other questions. So we'll go into our standard release plan summary, and we'll start with our WEIM release plan for the remaining items for 2022. So we do have coming up in May for trade date May 3rd, the BPA activation and the Tucson electric power activation. And related to that, we also have our JOU pilot that will activate on that same trade date. For our independent items for WEIM, we do have a couple of enhancements that are still pending. We have our shared ramping constraints and then our ETSR UI enhancements. So for our shared ramping constraint, that one is feasible to activate in the spring. For the ETSR UI, we see a longer horizon or timeline for ETSR UI, so we do anticipate that will be later in the year. So those two will follow their separate tracks and are independent of each other, and we'll continue to drive them as such. But as far as the implementation goes, shared ramping constraint is on track with spring, and then ETSR UI will follow later on this year as an independent effort. Moving on to our standard release plan, we have our 2022 independent items, and so starting with the efforts that are driven for pre-summer, we have the AWE to EEA transition for 5.1. We have our transmission service and market scheduling priorities, resource efficiency evaluation, adjustment to intertie constraint penalty prices, and RDRR. All for pre-summer, those are targets for 6.1. And then short, long start definitions is also on track now for June 1st. And then we have our interconnection process enhancements, phase 1 for our tariff and BPM changes that will go to the board in May. And then we also have our collection of OSI enhancements that will be throughout the year. For fall, we have hybrid resources 2B, FRP improvements, FERC 2222, and central procurement entity implementation. Some of you who have been following along may notice that we did remove the sub-entity SC role implementation. So at this point, we are having that go back to through the WEIM stakeholder prioritization process to determine the priority and the timeline of that, but it is no longer in the fall 2022 release. Okay, so I'll pause here. I see that there is a hand raised.
Yes. Please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Hi, Trang. It's Lindsay Schlugway from NV Energy. I had a quick question on slide 95, I think. There's two, EIM enhancements that are independent. Which one of those is the one that is going to have, I guess, the change where if you have a resource-based schedule, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's online unless the self-schedule is applied?
You know, Lindsay, I'm going to open that up to anybody on the ISO side that may have some insight. I actually don't know. So,
okay.
Does anybody on the ISO? Can anybody on the ISO team weigh in on that? Lindsay, and then if not, then we can go to that slide as well and see if there's detailed information on those two items in the specific slide for those enhancements and see if that answers your question. If not, we'll definitely take that back. Okay?
Okay.
So,
perfect. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks for the question. So we'll go ahead and take a look at that slide once we get there and see if we have that detail. So I'm going to go ahead and move forward to the WEIM Spring 2022 release. So the update here is that we are continuing the parallel operations through mid-April, but we are filing the readiness certification for the remaining WEIM implementations for BPA and Tucson tomorrow. So by tomorrow, you should be able to see that on the Western EIM site, as well as on the CAISO website under the FERC filings. So, so then we'll be able to mark that off for the next rug. And then we are on track. Next step is going to be activation on May 3rd. Okay, so I'll move forward to JOU. This is just a reference of some of the FERC filings and orders for JOU. So this one, again, is tracking along with the previous EIM activations for May 3rd. And then next we'll go into the enhancements. Lindsay, for these are, this is a slide that I was referring to that will have the shared ramping capability constraint and then the ETSR UI change. And so I invite you to maybe look at this slide and see if that addresses your question. And then maybe we can check in with you later on in the presentation to see if that does. Lindsay, I do see your hand raised, so please go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I think I was just unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Great. So yes, on this slide, so it says that it's both the shared ramping capability and the ETSR for the high-level project scope, but it sounds like you're going to split them up and release them at different times. But this is the slide I was referencing about the base schedule, that it'll make the change when units are base scheduled. It will still allow the market to move those resources to offline. So I'm just trying to determine at which one of these that change would be made.
Okay, and you're referring
to
that
be split.
Okay, thank you. So you're referring to that top item under system high-level changes, it looks like. Okay, great. So I will take that back, Lindsay, and then see if we can clarify that for you. And maybe, yeah, okay, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so we'll go ahead and move on then. All right, so we'll go into our independent 2022 releases. We'll start as usual with a matrix, and there's a lot of activity happening in the implementation space now. So I'll kind of walk through by each initiative, kind of what the latest milestone completed was and what's coming up next. So for the AWE to EEA transition, we did get our PRR out for the market ops BPM change. So that was done last week. And our next milestone is going to be the training on April 20th. And we're on track for the production activation of the AWE to EEA transition on May 1st. For transmission service and market scheduling priorities, we have published the draft OASIS tech spec last week, and that is on the dev site. We do have upcoming cyber tech specs that are planned for April. And then just a reminder on the tariff is that we did get a FERC acceptance on March 15th of the extension of the load export and wheeling provisions. We have BPM changes that are coming up, so you should see those within the next few weeks. And then training, the schedule will be, the target will be prior to the market simulation, and we're still working on defining the specific date, but you can expect to see that on the training calendar and as well as an announcement coming out once we have that confirmed. Then we have market sim for starting the first week of May, and then the production activation on June 1st. For resource efficiency, we have the tech specs for Oasis, a draft tech specs posted on March 25th. And then for CMRI, we have the draft tech specs that are planned for next week. For the tariff filing is referenced there already for a 60-day notice. And for BPMs, we'll have some PRRs coming up within the next month or so for those. Training will be planned prior to the market simulation, and we'll also have a communication go out with that, and the market simulation is planned for May, but the specific schedule is to be determined. And then the production activation for 6.1 indicates the core market engine functionality that we're prioritizing for 6.1. And as we discussed previously, the UIs for the transparency items, including CMRI and Oasis, will be prioritized after that. And then the APIs for the CMRI and Oasis will be our third priority. And so the schedule for the CMRI and Oasis changes, we will announce that once we have the date confirmed. For adjustment to intertie constraint penalty prices, we have the filing already with FERC that's referenced there. The PRR 1411 has been on the BPM site since February 28th. And then you can expect in April for a communication to come out. As we will not have a training, we'll reference the appropriate material in the communication that will go out, and then that one is on track for June 1st. For RDRR, we have, again, the filing that was made on March 23rd, and this, in April, we'll be publishing posting the PRRs for those BPM changes for market instruments and market operations. Training is confirmed for April 11th at this time, but again, stay tuned to the customer notice for that. And for market simulation, we are on track to start that on April 19th and on track now for a June 1st activation. So that's the pre-summer items. And then we have the short long start that also has a lot of activity recently as well. So we did file the tariff. So we went to the board on the 16th, and then we filed a tariff on the 24th for short long start definitions. And we have a lot of PRRs that were published on March 24th for the BPM changes across several different BPMs. For training, we'll have a communication go out, and for production activation, we are on track for 6.1, pending, again, the FERC approval of that. And then for interconnection process improvements, we don't have system changes there. So our next milestone is going to be the board presentation in May for that, and then we'll file the tariff in May or June, and then the BPM, the PRRs will come for the BPM changes around that time frame as well. And this schedule allows for a September activation for interconnection process improvements, tariff, and BPM changes. Okay. And I'm going to check the chat for just a moment. Okay, so I'm going to stop here for any questions or comments. And I'm not sure if the hand raise feature is working, but the event producer, could you confirm if there's any hands raised?
I do not see any hands raised in the queue.
Okay, great. Then I'll continue on. So sorry, we had a duplicate of the transparency enhancement slide. So for market simulation for pre-summer, we have RDRR, transmission service, market scheduling priorities, and RSE that are planned. So we have asked market participants to register for their participation in market simulation by April 7th, if you're interested. The market simulation plan is available on the release planning page that was published this week. And then we are on track to have the kickoff call on April 7th. So even though the market simulation for RDRR actually starts on April 19th, which we'll update here, we still do plan to have the market sim call on the 7th just to prepare for the upcoming market simulations. Okay. All right. I'll move forward to the individual slides. So for AWE, CAISO, AWE to NERC EEA, we went through the training schedule, and then this is on track for May 1st. So I'll go through to transmission service and market scheduling priorities. And so the next item for this will be the cyber tech specs in April, as well as some PRRs for the BPM changes coming in April. And then external training will be likely towards the end of April to support that market simulation first week of May, and activation for June 1st. For RSE, the next milestone here will be the CMRI tech specs, and those will be draft tech specs. So those are planned to publish next week. And then we also have upcoming BAYOP tech specs that we will confirm the schedule for. Then BPM changes will come likely in April, and then the external training once we have a more firm market sim start that will be announced. And again, this production activation, so for the next rug on Tuesday, you'll see us break out the different activation dates. So this June 1st production activation will be for that core market functionality. That's our top priority for June 1st. And then we'll separate the transparency item UI delivery and then the API. And so those will, you'll see as two separate line items that will communicate the schedules as we have that confirmed. For adjustment to intertie constraint penalty prices, the next thing to expect here is going to be the communications coming out in April to highlight the changes for this initiative, and then the production activation on June 1st. For RDRR, so again, we filed the tariff already on March 23rd. And then BPM changes will be coming this month, April, next month. And then the external training will be April 11th to support the market simulation on April 19th. And then this is on track for June 1st activation as well. Okay. And then short, long start, again, look for another external customer communication here prior to the activation on June 1st. And this one, again, we're expecting for approval of this within 60 days of the filing that was made on the 24th for June 1st activation. And then this last one for interconnection process enhancements, phase 1. So this is just going to be tariff and BPM changes, no system changes, and we will go to the board in May on the 11th, and then the tariff filing will follow as well as the BPM changes. And right now we're projecting a September activation of those BPM and tariff changes. And then we have one more independent item for OSI. So the next thing here will be the BRS for the additional items for 2022, and that will be published April 18th. And then this is just a summary of the remaining items that we had in the 2021 BRS and the status of those ones. And for the 2022 BRS, you can see below the list of systems that you'll see enhancements for, and that's to be confirmed once we get that BRS to you in April. Okay. So any questions or comments on the independent 2022 initiative? I see a hand raised. Event producer, could you confirm?
Yes. Please go ahead. The line is unmuted.
Chang, this is Chen Yu. A couple of questions. In terms of I look at I forget which slide, it's the market sim plan. The starting day of the market sim still says the 11 or I forget.
Yeah.
Or 7. Is it still expected, or is that starting day is the 19th?
No, thank you. So we do plan to start the market simulation on the 19th. That slide I need to update to reflect that the RDRR market sim, it shows the 13th, but it actually will start the 19th. And the market simulation call I confirmed with Anshuman will still kick that off on April 7th. And I think that there will be value there because at that point we will have the registrations for market simulation submitted, and those that are interested, then we can walk through the next steps of any setup needed to prepare for the market simulations that are happening starting April 19th. So we will still have that.
Great. That's great. Thank you. And one more question. So thinking about the UI and API delivery, aside from RFE, is the transmission project, the transmission priority, is that going to also have the UI and API delivery time may be different, or is that we shall expect the UI and API all at once?
That's a great question. So we have reviewed internally transmission service market scheduling priorities, and at this point, the schedule does show that we can maintain all of the scope there to activate the same time on together. So the market changes and the transparency items for OASIS, including the UI and the API, we intend to implement all together. But I'll open that up to Jamie and see if she wants to add anything else on to distinguish between those.
I don't have anything to add.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jamie. So, Chen-Yu, I hope that helps.
Yeah, thanks, Trey.
Okay, thank you. All right. Okay, so I think with that, since we have the RUG next week, I'm going to stop here because the next updates are going to be for the fall, and that's available in the presentation for anybody to review and then come to the RUG with questions or ask us questions offline. If there's no other questions, then Brenda, I'll hand that back over to you.
Thank you, Trang. I appreciate going over many of these slides that will also be provided at the release user group next week on Tuesday. So feel free to join that. That is at 10 a.m. if I'm correct. So yeah, every 2 weeks. So feel free to visit the master calendar for that WebEx link here. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap up this meeting. I do have a few meeting reminders to follow the next few slides. Our next scheduled meeting for our market performance planning meeting will be on the 16th. All related materials are posted here. You are able to send any topic suggestions or comments through the city tool by making sure you click on Market Performance and Planning Forum as a category. Also, we can redirect any questions by messaging us through the ISO Stakeholder Affairs at KISO.com. There was a chat question provided by Guillermo for Alva about the 3,000 megawatts, I believe. So feel free to look at that. This was just a follow-up question to Alva's question about the storage resources. So we are doing our very best to provide any questions and answers to our stakeholders, and we really appreciate any questions through chat. We're able to answer those more promptly since phone calls are much more more constrained. But now we can go ahead and just give you a visual of the next three meetings are coming up. So we plan to post our slides on the Tuesday, the 14th, with the meeting date of the 16th on Thursday, and then September will follow that, and the December date on the first week of December. But if you have any questions, this is also posted under our Market Performance and Planning Forum meetings with any additional information as well. And then lastly, we do have an upcoming stakeholder symposium in person this year. We're really lucky to have this opportunity to host it at the Safe Credit Union Convention Center in downtown Sacramento. It's a brand new facility, brand new convention center. I hope you all can come and let your managers know about this and any of your coworkers that it's going to be hosted on November 9th through 10th. And our registration will be opening up in May of this year, so please make sure you keep an eye on any public notices about that. As well, we have a stakeholder symposium website that will do our best to keep up-to-date information. And if you have any direct questions about the symposium, we also manage the symposium registration at CAISO.com, so we can definitely help you with those extra unique requests or registration. So now I will go ahead and wrap up this wonderful meeting we had with all of you. I definitely appreciate Guillermo, Kuhn, Jamie, Trang, and Brad, and then Adrian for stepping up and helping me for this wonderful meeting. We will have this recorded and posted onto a website within the next few business days, so you could definitely send that link over to anyone who wasn't at this meeting. We do understand and ahead of time that there was a minor conflict around 11:30 for the other meeting, so we appreciate your concerns, but we definitely are having this recorded, as well as the release user group meeting that's coming up next Tuesday. We'll have more of the information that Trang went over for the fall release for 2022. But other than that, we will make sure we go back to Guillermo's slides that he presented and kind of keep that engaged for the next upcoming June 16th meeting. So I appreciate everyone's participation for those who are still online, and I hope you guys all have a wonderful week. Thank you, everyone. And passing back to my event producer to close.
Thank you, Brenda. That concludes our conference. Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.